Good evening. Glad you're here. We have visitors. Glad that our visitors are with us tonight as well. We're in Mark chapter 8. If you want to go ahead and turn there, we'll be there in just a moment. Mark chapter 8. One of the things we've noticed is this continuing cycle of the people being amazed at Jesus. They are astonished, amazed. There are a lot of words that are used that talk about their response to the miracles of Jesus, to the teaching of Jesus, whatever it might be. They see him as one who teaches in a very different, unique way. They see the miracles that he performs, and they are astonished. He casts out demons. They are astonished. And yet at the end of that, there are still those who make one of two choices, and that is there are those who choose to either believe him or to reject him. And many times what we've seen is that the religious leaders of the day have made up their mind and they've chosen to oppose him. Not just not believe, but they've chosen to oppose him. To determine that he must die, to determine that he must not be able to carry on his mission and that they're going to take care of that. That's something that they decide. So the pattern seems to be clear, and that is Jesus going about doing good works, going about teaching. He came to teach, and so let us go into the other villages where we can do what I came to do, which was to teach. And so now he's performing miracles. He's doing these things that are quite obviously against nature. You couldn't do those if you were anyone else, but still they say he must be from Beelzebub. He must be actually doing it under the power of the devil or something like that. Others say, no, he's actually insane. And so you have that response, but the response is they don't just not believe, but there are some who oppose him. And so that's kind of the thing that we're in. And Jesus is going to continue to perform miracles. He's going to continue to do that. Mark's recording those because what Mark is trying to do is to show us who Jesus is. He's trying to introduce the audience to Jesus. Obviously, all of the Gospels are trying to introduce Jesus. Mark does it in just a little different way. But all of the Gospels are introducing Jesus, though John is the only one that really says it outright, where he says, I've given you enough evidence so that you can make a choice to believe or not believe. John 20, 30, and 31. So the outright statement is not necessarily made, but there is this observation that we make as we work our way through the Gospels that their mission, their purpose is to introduce Jesus, and that's what Mark is doing. So that brings us to chapter 8. And you might remember that we already have seen a similar story when in Mark chapter 6, Jesus would be looking out at that crowd that was around him, the crowd that was there, and he looked at them as being one that was like sheep without a shepherd, and so you have that. That record there that would also be a demonstration of the same kind of thing that we have here, chapter 6, verse 30, beginning where Jesus feeds the 5,000. Let's see. When they came, it grew late, verse 35. This is a desolate place. The hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages, buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. So you remember that's the way that Jesus responded there in the feeding of the 5,000. This is going to be a little different. The context is going to be much the same, but it's going to be a little bit different because Jesus is going to have compassion on the crowds. He's going to find a way to feed them, and obviously that way is going to be by performing a miracle. Chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. Here are the words of Jesus. I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away." So there are some significant statements that Jesus makes there that let us see something about the situation. One of those is that he had compassion. That's not unusual. We've seen that already, as I've mentioned. He had compassion on the crowd. And the other thing is we recognize that there's this very large crowd, the 5,000, 4,000. That's a lot of folks. The idea of having that many people gathered around you and pressing upon you, that seemed to be the life of Jesus. That seemed to be the way that Jesus was functioning day in and day out, because every time you see him, he's running away from the people, trying to get in a more solitary place, or he's encompassed about by these people. Even when he's on the way to heal this little girl, the woman interrupts, and so there's this pressing of the crowds, and so the crowd is something that is usual around Jesus. So you're also introduced to that there in the statement of Jesus. He talks about compassion, he talks about the crowd, and then he says, "Some of them have been with me 3 days now with nothing to eat." Now, even in the Jewish way of counting time, that's still a long time. I barely go 3 hours without eating. I try to eat smaller meals and do it more often, and so I'll do a small breakfast and then a snack midday and then a lighter lunch. And so if I don't do that, if you see me around 11:30 and I haven't had my mid-morning snack, then I'm like, what do they call it, hangry now? Yeah, okay, so I'm probably going to be kind of that way. So they've been 3 days. No matter how you count the time, that's a long time without food. Did they grab did they grab a fig somewhere? Did they grab a handful of grapes? Did they walk through a wheat field and grab some? I don't know what they did. I just know Jesus says they haven't had anything to eat. It just says in the English Standard. English Standard says they've been with me on 3 days and have nothing to eat. It just says they have nothing at this point. Yes. Yeah. They have already been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming they had some food that they had given out. Yeah. That's what I'm assuming too. But there's no. The point is they have no food at this moment. There's nothing for them to eat. So the things that he lets us see there, they've been with him 3 days, they've been following, and the thing that he then mentions is if you send them away back to their homes, then they're not going to be able to make it because they don't have anything to eat. They'll faint on the way. And some of them, he says, have come from far away. I'm not sure how far away, but one of the things that we remember is that it wasn't very far back in chapter 7, especially when you go to chapter 7, verse 24, that Jesus is in the presence of and has moved into some Gentile area. And as a result of that, I don't know if some of those have followed him. I don't know if there's some of that going on. Oftentimes the word or that description of far away describes Gentiles. But there's no real hint here that that's really what that might mean. But they are some of them from a distance away. And so Jesus' statement is we have to deal with this emergency that we have now that's with us. We can't ignore it. We have to deal with it. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So maybe, and that's what he's looking maybe too, even though they may be used to not having food for 2 or 3 days, they're not used to traveling there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've got to feed. Yeah. Yeah, good observation. The the crux of the moment is, and the difficulty is, if you send them away, they still have nothing to eat. And they've got to get home to get something to eat because, I mean, by this time, omelet shops closed? Oh, there are no omelet shops. Yeah, okay. So the setting of the scene is there in Jesus' words in verses 2 and 3. If you go back to what Mark writes, in those days when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he calls his disciples to him and he said to them. So Mark lays that foundation as well. He talks about the great crowd and he says again, remember we emphasized that seems to be the way things are going, that there is always this great crowd around him. There's a great crowd that's gathered. They have nothing to eat, and Jesus calls his disciples to him. And that's what he says then in verses 2 and 3. So he looks upon this crowd, I think in the same way he would have in chapter 6 when he looks upon them with great compassion. It even says that in verse 2. They're in a place where they're not going to be able to get any food. At that time in chapter 6, there was the feeding of the 5,000. They were in the wilderness, and they found a little boy's lunch, 5 loaves, 2 fish. And Jesus says we need to feed this crowd because they are hungry, and that is a demonstration of his compassion. And so my question is, did the disciples expect a different response this time than last time? I mean, they were with him before, remember? Their response was, there's nothing here to eat. There's nothing, what are we going to do? We need to send them away. And they saw the miracle. As a matter of fact, they were the ones passing out the food that Jesus was multiplying. So they also took up the basketfuls of leftovers. And so did they expect something different this time?
The other feeding, now all of a sudden they can't figure out how to do it again. Mm-hmm. They have to ask him. I mean, it's amazing to me that their memories are kind of short.
Yes. I think we've made our point very well about the lack of faith of the disciples, but I think that's kind of what's going on here is a lack of being able to remember, or lack of faith, or what do we do here? Maybe it's kind of up in the air. I'm not sure how we respond to this, but notice what the disciples say in verse 4. I think this reveals a little bit about their state of mind. His disciples answered, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" What does that tell you about their disposition, about their memory or their faith? What does that tell you about it? They're still lacking in understanding. There's still this lack of, and maybe it's this, I'm not sure, but one of the things that seemed to come to my mind was, are any of those disciples, one of those disciples, and you think it would be Peter, who would come to him and say, "You did it last time, do it again. You did it last time, here's 7 loaves, do it again." But Peter didn't do that. I don't know that. I'm saying that the word that's used there sometimes can refer to those who are, as a matter of fact, Peter used that in Acts 2. Those who are afar off. But no, I don't know that these were Gentiles. It seems that the difference in this is very small. Jesus is still going to multiply. He's still going to use a small amount and multiply it. And he's going to feed a multitude. So it's still going to be a miracle that has a point, though. Because when we get through with this miracle and you walk away, you're going to miss the point. See, he makes the point once this miracle is over. He's going to make that point. But I think that's what he's doing. He's demonstrating something here with this miracle as he did with the other one. Okay, so how can one do it? They ask in verse 4. Verse 5, he said, how many loaves do you have? And they said, we have 7. He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them, gave them to his disciples, and set them to the people. And they set them before the crowd. They had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to them, also should be set, that they also should be set before them. They ate, were satisfied. They took up the broken pieces, leftovers, 7 basketfuls, and there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately got in the boat with the disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. And this is where he's going to interact with the Pharisees, and then we're going to have this great point made about this. But let's stop right there, because there's 7 loaves. It describes having a few fish, so you've got a very similar setting as before. And it's fascinating to me that there's this same kind of interaction with the disciples as there was before Jesus fed the 5,000. The same kind of interaction, the same kind of what are we going to do? And Jesus takes care of that. He approaches the difficulty of the situation straightforward. And though his disciples were displaying a lack of being able to depend on him this time, they did that the last time, but he proved them wrong. He proved that they were also that he was also up to the task of feeding the 5,000, even though they had very little resource. Well, they didn't have any more resource. This time they had 7 baskets full of leftovers, and so you have this same kind of miracle as took place in chapter 6. So the spiritual condition of the disciples, one commentator said that they were spiritually dull. They were hard of hearing spiritually. I don't know exactly where we put them in this, but one of the things that is obvious is their response is no different than it was the first time. Their response is, we need to send them away, or we can't do this. There's no way that we're going to be able to feed this many people here with the little resource that we have. So you have Jesus feeding these 4,000 here in this reading in Mark 8, 1 through 10. All right, let me pause and let you make some kind of observation, or maybe you have questions, or we'll call something to our attention. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I like to consider those kind of questions as well, because when you think about the 12 baskets full of leftover, I'm sure that nothing went to waste, and those were breakfast for the disciples the next day. That's just they had 12 basketfuls. Each apostle had one basket. Here you got 7, so I guess they're getting a fight over who gets those back. Yeah, they had to share, didn't they? And that's something they hadn't learned to do yet either, is share. So Jesus is going to teach them about sharing for sure. Any other observations, maybe about this miracle of the feeding of the 4,000? Mm-hmm. They could have, yes. He sent them away. We don't know, but one of the things I find very interesting is once the miracle is done, then Jesus sends them away. There is no, you're going to hang around, or you're going to stay with me, and when breakfast comes around, we're not going to do this again. I don't know if that was his reasoning, but when the miracle was complete, everybody has been fed. Matter of fact, I think one of the things that this teaches is the fact that Jesus satisfies completely, because in both of these instances of the feedings, he gave them enough food to eat till they were all full. So they were satisfied. It was like going to this buffet and you got all you want, so you don't leave there hungry. They were filled. They were satisfied. So I think even I've heard a sermon before, something like the Jesus who completely... Yeah, sure. Yeah. So he sends them away, and whatever reason, as Maury says, that he doesn't want them to become dependent on this, but he does send them away, and then he got in the boat, and he and his disciples went to another place. Okay. Gina says that she believes that the disciples believed, but maybe there's some trepidation on their part, that maybe they just wanted to see if he would do it again. They knew he could, but is that really what he wants to do right now? Not sure. Okay, look at verses 11 through 13, because I think what follows is going to be a little bit about what has just taken place in this miracle. And of course, this is going to be for the benefit of the disciples, not the crowd, because he sent them away. But in verses 11 through 13, the Pharisees come to Jesus and begin to argue with him. And this is where they demand a sign. Actually, the English Standard says a sign from heaven, and it says to test him. So the reason they asked for this sign from heaven was not because they were possible believers, not because they were wanting a little more evidence before they actually turned their lives over to him. The reason, and Mark points it out, the reason they asked him for a sign from heaven was to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit, and he said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got in the boat again, and went to the other side. Now, this doesn't end there, because he goes on to talk about the leaven of the Pharisees. So let me connect it. Now, they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. That's what they did with the leftovers. They brought some of it with them. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" So Jesus, if you left after at the intermission, after Jesus did the miracle, fed the 4,000, if you left, then you missed the explanations and you missed the points that Jesus is making now after this miracle takes place, and he's trying to teach his disciples these very valuable lessons. And as they get in the boat, well, let me go back to the Pharisees. So the Pharisees are saying, we want a sign, and we want a sign that will prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that you are God. We want something spectacular. We want something that's amazing and will wow us. Now, what does that tell you about them if what Jesus has already done didn't wow them. They weren't going to be wowed. No, it didn't matter what Jesus. Now, I guess if he pulled a mountain, if he took a mountain and rooted it up and turned it upside down and set it down in the middle of Jerusalem or something, I don't know what it would take. I don't know. But the bottom line is their motivation was not honest and sincere. Mark tells us that. The reason they said that was in order to test him. And he goes on to say, there's not going to be a sign given. And I think by saying that, what he says is, what you're already seeing should be sufficient. What you're already witnessing should be enough, because when he sits in a synagogue and he begins to teach, people are astonished. When he casts out the demon and people see that, they are astonished. And when he heals the sick and when he raises the dead, people are astonished. And if they're not seeing that and witnessing that and being wowed by that, then I'm not going to give you something else. That should be sufficient. What I have come to do and what I have done should be sufficient evidence to prove to you I am who I say I am. So he left them, got in the boat, and went to the other side of the sea. All right, anything that you'd like to comment about verses 11 through 13? He did, yes.
They weren't there for it. There was no right answer. They were going to just condemn him for whatever he came up with. I mean, he knew what they were after. It was not anything except evil.
Mm-hmm. Did you notice the beginning of verse 12? And he sighed deeply before he answered them. I'm not sure all of the meaning behind that, but I know what it means when I do that. I've got to deal with this now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. It's you don't get it. You don't understand that I know what you're thinking. I know your heart. I know why you asked me to do that. I know all about it. I know everything about you. And here you are pushing this agenda. And so Jesus tells him, not going to do it. You're not going to see a miracle greater than what you've already seen. I think that's enough proof, and he just leaves. So now they get in the boat, and he has one loaf of bread. Now, I was joking about the leftovers, but the reason he has that loaf of bread is to use it as an object lesson. Trey likes to use object lessons, don't you? A friend of mine was talking about 5 kernels of truth, and he started throwing corn out at the crowd, and I thought, well, I don't know that went over very well, but he was throwing the 5 kernels out. But he has a loaf of bread, and what do you think his subject is going to be about this loaf of bread that he holds in his hand? They're in the boat, he and his disciples, and he cautioned them, saying, this is verse 15, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So there's this warning in verse 14 and following that actually goes through about verse 21, where Jesus is giving some very significant spiritual teaching to his disciples, but I think they miss it. I think they're having a real difficult time struggling. They're trying to grasp maybe, but just not getting it as they should. And then once he tells them about the influence to beware of the influence of the Pharisees and Herod, they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. Isn't that typical of these disciples? Jesus is trying to teach a very spiritual lesson. And where's their mind? It's food. Yeah, we need food. And remember, we talked about the fact that when he feeds the 4,000 as well as the 5,000, one of the things that demonstrated is that Jesus is able to fill completely. He's able to satisfy completely. There will be no lacking in that. We're talking about a spiritual application here. We're not talking about filling the belly. We're talking about spiritually speaking. So he has this loaf of bread, and he starts trying to tell the disciples about how you need to be very wary and be very alert and do not be swayed by the influence of these religious leaders of the day. And the thing that they jump to immediately is, where's breakfast? Where's lunch? We don't have any bread. That's what they jump to immediately, verse 16. I'm surprised that he doesn't sigh again here, aren't you? But it says Jesus was aware of this. Now I'm sure the fishing boat is not a very big boat. I think probably about 16 feet, 19 feet, something like that long. They're usually not real huge boats, but so if they're in one end, Jesus in the other end, it'd be hard for him not to hear the conversation. But even if they were whispering, and even if they were trying to keep their conversation from him, Jesus would have heard and known what they were talking about. So verse 17 says, Jesus is aware of their conversation about the fact that we have no bread. What are we going to eat? That's their concern. And he says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Why are you talking about that? And then he goes on to describe in spiritual terms. Here's what he says. Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? You have eyes, but you don't see. You have ears, but you don't hear. And you don't remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and I broke the 7 for the 4,000, and you took up leftovers for each one of those. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? Now, Jesus is not through, though, because the next thing he's going to do is to heal a blind man. Okay, there's a connection. There's a connection because Mark's writing this in this succession, and Jesus has just talked about you have eyes, but you do not see. And it's not an accident that the next miracle that's going to be performed by Jesus is he's going to heal a blind man. I think it's no accident. Because this is kind of layer upon layer of trying to grasp the spiritual teachings that are going on about spiritual hunger and spiritual fulfillment, and Jesus is able to fully fill and fully satisfy. And the signs that you are seeing among you now at this moment are proof sufficient that he is who he claims to be. And Jesus tries to warn them about those Pharisees who came to him. They heard this conversation, and the Pharisees say, we want a sign. They're trying to test him. We want a sign from heaven. And the next thing he does is goes to the disciples and says, those guys, you remember those guys? Beware of them. Beware of their influence. And he's holding this loaf of bread, possibly left over from the miracles. Don't know. Okay, there we are through 21. Our time's getting away from us, but let's take some opportunity to make any observations you'd like to make. So you're saying the leaven is the influence that they have? Yes, yeah. The leaven is what influences the physical bread to be a loaf. It's that which causes it to become what it was intended to be. And so you have the same idea when Jesus says you're the light of the world. You're influence. You're the salt of the earth. You're the influence in the world. And so he says, beware of this leaven of the Pharisees and Herod, which is their influence and their teaching and what they're going to try to persuade you to do and the way they're going to try to lead you. Any other observation? Ryan, why does he include "and Herod" here? Yeah. What's the connection between the Pharisees and this leaven and this influence, and then he adds "and Herod"?
The Herodians, they would have been more Hellenistic, I guess.
They were more concerned about fitting in with the culture, the Greek culture, their political.
They were more, what's the word I'm looking for, worldly.
Okay, worldly, yeah.
And they wanted to get along with everybody, the Jews, the Romans, and everybody. Let's just all get along and accept everyone, and everything's okay.
Okay, so what you've got here is he says, beware of the Pharisees. They're the conservatives. They're going to be less likely to accept something that's kind of far out. And then you've got the Herodians that are on this other side that would be willy-nilly accept everything and welcome you in with a big sloppy kiss. You're the best thing ever was. Both sides, right? You've got both sides. Yeah. Beware of both sides, because both of them are wrong. Both of them are going to pull you down a path that's going to lead you to destruction. So align yourself with one and think you're good and right and righteous and holy and good and all that. Jesus says, beware of both extremes.
I thought that's what leaven represented. It was that, who was sin, that they were bringing them into that sinful nature that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. When they were told, when the Jews were to remove the leaven, then that would be the purpose of getting all the sin out, I think. In this situation, I think he's just basically saying, beware of their influence, beware of that, the possibilities of where they're going to lead you. Yeah, it would be into sin, of course. Okay, because of time, let me just let you read the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. That's 22 through 26, so it's not very long, but read that and read it in light of what we've already talked about in chapter 8 through this moment. So really chapter 8, verse 1, all the way through verse 26 is going to give us some real insight into how Jesus is trying to teach his disciples and trying to get these spiritual ideas and concepts over to them. And these miracles that he does is going to prove that he is who he says he is, but he also he's making a point also. And I think that's what's going on here as he heals this blind man. So you can go home and read that one, and we'll pick up right along in there next week. We may refer to that and then go all the way to verse 27. But I appreciate your comments.